Hello and welcome to RBQM Live 2023. My name's Patrick Hughes. I'm the co-founder, or one of the co-founders and chief commercial officer for CluePoints. And I'm really delighted to introduce the entire event, but more importantly, the keynote session for RBQM Live 2023, which is entitled The Global Transformation of RBQM, Research Study Findings from a 2023 survey and executive roundtable discussion. My colleague today on the call and on the web seminar is our keynote speaker, Ken Getz, who is the executive director and professor for the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. Ken, presumably for everybody online today, needs no introduction, but I am really delighted, Ken, that you're able to join us as usual at these events to give us the latest and greatest insights. And during this session, we're going to delve into the latest research conducted by Tufts CSDD, which provides a first-hand perspective on the comprehensive adoption of RBQM and its associated challenges. But additionally, we're also going to examine the implication of the recent updates and regulatory guidance outlined in ICH E6R3 and their relevance to research throughout the industry, whether you're a sponsor or a CRO. Before we get started, I'd like to call out the question and answer, the Q&A feature on your screen. On the feed that you will have in front of you, you'll be able to ask as many questions as you feel you want answers to. You won't be able to see questions that are submitted by other people, but don't worry, we've got all of that under control. We're able to view all of those questions and we'll be answering as many of those questions as possible at the end of the session. Now, what you've all been waiting for, I'm sure, is Ken Getz. So Ken, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for such a nice introduction. And let me say, I always enjoy being a part of RBQM Live. I feel like it's a tradition that I have this privilege of joining you at this program and a privilege of sharing new insights and new data that I hope will stimulate a lot of discussion and insights. And I just want to thank the organizers of RBQM Live for the invitation and the opportunity for me to be here. So let's go right into our material. And I want to really start with a brief look at the agenda for the day. So let's go to this slide, the agenda slide. And I'd like to begin by taking a big step back and looking at the context within which RBQM adoption is unfolding. And by that, I mean a look specifically at the current drug development operating environment, the compelling need for strategies and tactics that can drive quality, speed, and efficiency, and the intensely competitive environment in which we operate. So I'll begin with that high-level look at that current environment, and that will set the stage for a look specifically at this study and its rationale. And then we'll move right into highlights from the study. And I want to mention that a detailed discussion of all of the results has been developed in a manuscript that is currently under review, and we hope will be published within the next 6 to 8 weeks. So let's go to the next slide. And we'll begin with this very high level look on the left-hand side at one measure of the remarkable productivity of the drug development enterprise today. There are many measures that we can look at. Here we're looking just at the total number of drugs and biologics that are in active clinical testing, phase 1 through 3, pre-approval testing. And we've adjusted the measure here, so we're not including those active compounds that we're targeting COVID-19. And what you see is steady 4% year over year growth in the number. We're now exceeding over 7,000 active compounds in clinical testing, dominated by the oncology segment, which represents about 28% of the total amount of activity at this time. But what's most interesting, perhaps, is the change in the composition of this pipeline of activity. And that's really summarized in the table on the right-hand side. Each column describes a different aspect of composition change. The first being the proliferation of small companies that as a segment dominate the sponsorship of clinical testing activity. We see such a large number of emerging and small companies today, many that are sponsoring a single active compound. And they have very different operating needs. They have very limited resources. They rely heavily on outside services providers, contract services providers to support them. The two columns over to the right-hand side of that table reflect the growing challenges and complexity of our pipeline today. A very high percentage of all drugs in development rely on biomarker data or genetic data. And so we're really in an environment with highly personalized, highly stratified development activity. We also see a very high percentage of drugs in active clinical trials that are targeting rare diseases. So these two columns really summarize other unique challenges, the challenge of recruiting ever more narrowly defined patient populations, the need to collect more data to actually help us address the requirements for more personalized or stratified drug development activity. All of this combined is driving up the complexity of drug development activity, and that is translating into a number of performance challenges. For example, our cycle times are much longer today than they've ever been in our history. On average, they're growing at roughly 6 to 8% a year, which is really quite remarkable. The typical phase 2 or phase 3 trial is taking about 40 to 50 months now from start to finish. Let's go to the next slide. Just a few other contextual factors for you. Our success rates are the lowest they have ever been in our history. Less than 10% of all drugs that enter clinical testing are ultimately approved. And the lowest success rates are in oncology, where only 1 in 20 drugs that enter testing will ultimately be approved. And the typical drug that enters the marketplace has a much lower expected level of revenue that it will generate. On the right-hand side, I'm showing you a table that articulates the risk-return profile of the typical drug in development. Time that our studies are more complex, they're taking longer, we're spending more dollars. The average return on a given drug is about half where it was 15 years ago, and the return on investment is about a quarter of what we saw in 2005. So it is an incredibly intense environment. If we go to the next slide, you'll see one shocking outcome of this current development environment. One of the ways that organizations have responded is in the way that we design our protocols around this current intense environment, where we're looking for more data that will help differentiate every compound and that will help rapidly identify and gather evidence to support safety, efficacy, and the positioning of the compound once it enters the marketplace. And this specific slide shows you one area that has really been impacted by that objective, and that is the area of growth in data volume. Just look at that change from 2010 to 2020, where you've seen growth from less than 1 million data points for a single pivotal trial protocol to 3.5 million data points. And this was in 2020. You can see on the right-hand side the growth in the number of endpoints and also the diversity of data sources that are now supporting our data management needs. We are seeing huge demand for capacity, for personnel to support very complex studies, and increasingly we're collecting more and more data that requires capacity and management capabilities. Let's go to the next slide. One other area that I want to highlight that has really characterized more recent operating environment, largely necessitated by the pandemic, was the increasing use of remote and virtual solutions. And at the Tufts Center, we had the luxury of doing an assessment among about 60 or 55 sponsor companies just before the pandemic hit, and then a follow-up assessment a year later. And you can see that across the board, in nearly every area, we saw pretty significant growth in the use of these solutions to support our clinical trial activity and maintain continuity to prevent the transmission of the COVID-19 virus, to really protect patient safety, and to leverage the value of some of these technologies and solutions through more remote applications. And we expected to see a similar increase in the use of RBM and RBQM, and that's reflected on the next slide. As many of you know, the quality by design principles and ICH E6R2 created the momentum, if you will, the encouragement from regulatory agencies to embrace and to use RBQM principles to support drug development activity. And this was very much a recognition of the growth in data volume and the need to streamline or simplify increasing complexity in our clinical trials. Over on the right-hand side, you see measures of RBQM adoption largely conducted by ACRO in two major landscape studies that it conducted in 2019 and 2020, where they essentially gathered data that showed a mirroring of the adoption growth that we saw necessitated by the pandemic in the use of virtual and remote technologies. The ACRO studies looked at 8 specific RBQM components, and it was data provided by 7 CROs reflecting on their client companies' use of these components. And they estimated that about 80%, nearly 80% of clinical trials were using at least one of those 8 components. We'll come back to this in a minute. Let's go to the next slide. And we saw a very curious change in the DCT usage environment as the pandemic effects and impact began to recede. What we saw essentially was a retrenchment or a reduction in the use of many of these remote and virtual solutions, in some cases as low, if not lower, than what was observed before the pandemic. What's going on here? Well, there are many factors. We believe, and based on our interviews and other assessments that have been performed, that in the absence of clear value proposition, a clear ROI, and a familiarity with the benefits and the risks of remote and virtual solutions usage, many organizations have reverted back to more piloting, more measured and cautious approach where they can gather more data and become more familiar with these technologies or solutions. And we believe that given the past assessment of RBM and RBQM adoption, that it may follow a similar pattern. And that was really the impetus for conducting our study. So let's go now to the next slide, and we'll transition to look at the specific Tufts CSDD study. And I want to just thank CluePoints and PricewaterhouseCoopers for providing funding of this or grant of this specific study. There were three primary objectives. The first was to get a 2023 read on the current levels of RBQM adoption, as well as anticipated levels moving forward. And this is particularly timely, as Patrick mentioned, given ICHE 6R3 currently in draft form. So here the idea was to gather attitudes and perceptions and experiences directly from the sponsor companies themselves to supplement the work that ACRO had done, where they looked specifically at CRO reported levels of adoption. We also approached the measure of adoption differently. Instead of looking at adoption as defined by one of 8 components, we looked at a much larger group of components, 31 in total, and we took an aggregate average of all of those components to measure RBQM adoption. So here, the idea was to go directly to sponsor companies to understand variation by company size and geographic location with a more comprehensive set of RBQM components assessed. And ultimately, we are looking to derive practical insights and implications that will inform adoption and help us address some of the barriers to adoption moving forward. So let's go to the next slide. We conducted a global survey in November of 22 through early February 2023. And as I mentioned, a manuscript is currently under review with very detailed results presented. We looked at a total of 31 components, and I'll share those components with you. And we conducted a number of statistical tests looking for significant differences by subgroup. We looked at variation around mean values, and we also looked at correlational relationships in usage and their connection to study performance in some cases as well. Let's go to the next slide. And here I'm just going to share with you some of the characteristics of our respondents. In total, we received responses from over 206 individuals. So we averaged about 2 responses per company. 125 distinct companies responded in total. And we saw relatively good distribution by subgroup within a number of these different categories. When we look at world region, 58% came from individuals based within North America, 31% from Europe, and 11% from rest of world. Most of our respondents are coming from pharma companies, nearly 80%. We had some CROs participate in the study as well. And we saw good discrimination by size of company. And here we define size based on the volume of annual clinical trial activity supported. Less than 25 trials per year. That was roughly a third of the companies that were represented. Between 25 to 100 trials annually, 36%. And over 100 trials annually, that was roughly 30% as well. We also saw responses from a number of different functional areas, most commonly from clinical operations and clinical development. Excuse me. Data management. Data management and data sciences represented roughly 22%, and 24% came from all other functional areas. Most of the roles within the company were also middle management, director level and manager level. 16% in the senior vice president level, and then a very small percentage, 8% from the C-suite level. Let's go to the next slide. This is a very dense slide and will be hard, no doubt, for you to read. So I'll just summarize it here. And as I mentioned, we'll be sharing these slides with you, and we'll also be publishing the detailed findings. So you'll be able to look at each individual component and its level of adoption expressed as a percentage of clinical trials in the portfolio. So there were 12 components. There were 12 components that were evaluated in the planning and design stage. And this stage, the components are all centered around planning and the identification of quality tolerance limits, for example, critical to quality factors, KRIs. So this is all really in the pre-execution stage, the planning stage. The second stage, we had 11 components that really made up the execution and monitoring of clinical trials. So this really represented ongoing assessment and support of RBQM principles. And the last stage, documentation and resolution, really related to the evaluation of these components and then steps that were taken, the identification of deviations, and then the reporting and resolution of those areas. So again, 31 components in total, 11 within the planning stage, or rather 12 in the planning stage, 11 in the execution stage, and 8 in that final documentation and resolution stage. Let's go now to the next slide. And for the remainder of the material, I'm going to be sharing with you the direct results of the study. And they present a very nice sense of the overall levels of adoption, as well as a kind of a maturity model by components, as well as by company size. So you can think of these as benchmarks that may apply to your individual organization. You'll get a good feel for the components as well as companies within a specific subgroup. This first result here is really a very high level assessment, self-assessment of familiarity. And this is the percentage of respondents who indicated that they felt very familiar with the principles of RBM and RBQM. And generally, we saw relatively high levels of self-assessment, not nearly perhaps as high as many of you might have expected. And we also saw a couple of areas where the self-reported level of familiarity was relatively low, most notably among data management and data sciences professionals or functions, as well as in the smaller clinical trial volume companies, where less than 2/3 rated their familiarity as being very high, or that extreme, a very familiar level. We'll reflect on this later as we go through more of the results. So let's go to the next slide. And this is now the overall reported level of adoption. It's what we can compare to the assessments that ACRO performed in its landscape studies. And here we see, when we look across all of the 31 components and we get an aggregate average, the results of this study indicate that about 57% of all clinical trials are using these components. Now, of course, there is wide variation within each of the different stages of usage and across the different components. Some will, of course, be higher, and a number of them will be lower, and we'll touch on that in a moment. But now you start to see some significant differences by company size, where the smallest trial volume companies report the lowest aggregate average level of adoption, less than 50% of their trials. And the larger companies are hovering at the 60% or slightly above 60% mark. We also found that respondents based in Europe perceived that their overall level of adoption was higher relative to their North American colleagues. 64% of all clinical trials compared to 54% of all trials. Now, I want to note here that in many cases, respondents went back and gathered direct data from their portfolio. Others worked very closely with their portfolio, and those with a high level of familiarity are very close to and could reflect on the average level of adoption by component use. If we now go to the next slide, I'm showing you variation by stage by company size. So here we're looking at the planning and design stage specifically. The level of adoption here is typically lower than you'll see in the documentation and resolution stage, slightly lower at 56% of clinical trials on average. And that same pattern carries where the smaller companies are generally reporting lower levels of adoption of the components in this stage. The next slide shows the top components that are used within the planning and design stage. And now you can see some of the variation. The highest level of reported use was in the risk assessment and risk control planning component. And then you start to see it settle down somewhat in the next set of components, the identification of critical data and processes, risk assessment to support optimal trial design, and the identification of study-specific KRIs. And it continues to drop off and drop lower as you look across other components within the planning and design stage. Let's go to the next slide. And we typically see the lowest levels of overall adoption in the execution stage. About half of all clinical trials are seeing an aggregate average during the execution stage of clinical trials. And now you start to see some really wide differences between the smallest companies at 40% versus the largest companies at greater than 100 trials annually, with a reported level of adoption of their clinical trials at 63% on average. The next slide shows some of the highest components. And here we generally saw closer relative usage across the portfolio of around 60%, 64% here, with the top areas of component usage, the periodic plan review and updating, KRI tracking, remote site monitoring, which some believe may continue to settle down as we move farther and farther away from the pandemic. The review of and use of data visualizations and the reduced amount of source data verification. Let's go to the next slide. And this last stage, we're looking now at documentation and resolution. And this was the highest reported area of adoption across the 8 components that were evaluated. So 60% of clinical trials are reportedly using these components, and we see virtually no difference by company size. They're all hovering relatively close to each other, with only a slightly lower level of usage or adoption as a percent of clinical trials for the smaller companies. The next slide shows the relative use of these individual components. And you see, again, quite high relative use of a number of them: the detection of risk, the verification of source data, the review of source data, and the evaluation and the follow-up of resolution when a risk has been identified or a deviation has been identified. So that gives you a general sense for the current levels of adoption. And as I mentioned, there's a lot more detail in the study by company size and by some other subgroups that were evaluated. So if you're looking for benchmarks to compare your organization against, this will be perhaps a useful set of results for you to refer to. Let's now shift gears and go to the next slide. And I want to spend a moment looking at some of the barriers to adoption. And we begin by looking at our full data set and the perceived benefits or the value proposition of RBQM. So these are the percentage of respondents rating each of these benefits somewhat well or very well. And what you see is essentially a very similar explanation to what we saw in the decline in the use of DCT technologies and solutions. Very, very high level, general reported level of commitment to support RBQM. And the question that was posed is, how committed is your organization to supporting RBQM? 83% of organizations reported somewhat well or very well. And a similarly high percentage said that their organization is very trusting or believes that RBQM will deliver on its promise of clinical trial quality. But we start to see a much softer and more of a mixed set of perceptions when we look at the belief in RBQM's ability to deliver on efficiency and cost savings, and perhaps even more so on cycle time reductions or on speed, delivering higher levels of speed in our clinical trials. This is a very important finding in the study because it starts to reflect on the, as I mentioned, the questions that are being posed about the value proposition and the ways that RBQM might deliver a return on the investments required to support it. So let's now go to the next slide, and you see variation by subgroup, in this case, again, by company size. The middle column shows you again the percentages that I presented in the previous slide. But this, the three columns to the right now show you variation by company size, with the smallest companies showing the lowest levels of reported commitment and even lower levels of trust or belief in the value proposition of RBQM, most notably in those two areas, the ability of RBQM to deliver efficiency and cost savings, and even more so in speed. Less than 40% of companies within that specific subgroup believe or trust in RBQM's ability to deliver in that area. And you see the relatively higher levels that were reported by the larger companies. The next slide starts to really get at some of the areas of perceived adoption barriers and challenges. So first, we looked at the mixed perceptions about the value proposition. Here we see reported areas that are presenting challenges to implementation. And the highest reported area by far is the lack of cross-functional awareness. But as you move down this list, one key observation is that several of these top challenges are all associated with change management difficulties. The lack of cross-functional awareness, the lack of cross-functional consensus, and the lack of necessary skills to support implementation. The other area is the perceived cost of implementation, or the investment of time required to implement. And these dovetail very nicely with the more mixed or softer impressions of the value proposition, and really help suggest some of the critical ways that we can stimulate adoption by addressing some of these challenges moving forward. And I'll go into that in a moment. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to reflect on now the future expectations for RBQM. And here we took the position that we wanted to understand that as adoption matures, where are places where we might expect to see the highest levels of growth in adoption. So we asked companies to project where they expected individual component usage might be as a percentage of clinical trials, essentially 3 years from now in 2027. And I'm showing you the top areas where adoption was expected to increase the most. In the planning and design stage, the gathering of patient input, soliciting of patient input in protocol design, the expected increase was considerably high relative to the low percentage of trials that are using that component today. The use of a centralized monitoring plan, also very high relative expected or projected usage relative to current use, 46% of trials. And the other top area within planning and design was the identification of critical to quality factors. In the execution stage, one of the areas where we saw very high expected growth was in the detection of duplicate patients, or patients essentially who are participating in multiple clinical trials simultaneously. Another area of growth is in the reduction in the number of data management reviews that are conducted during the execution stage, as well as quality tolerance limit monitoring. Another area of execution where we saw high relative expected increase in use. And then in the documentation and resolution stage, those three top areas: updating quality tolerance limit and KRI definitions, as well as the follow-up identification and resolution of quality tolerance limit deviations. And you see all of the projected increases in these areas as well. Let's go now to the next slide. And I just want to touch briefly on the use of AI and machine learning as a tool supporting RBQM. It was very early stage use of this analytical approach. Clearly, it's a very, very hot area of interest today, and we wanted to get a read in terms of its support of RBQM. You can see in the current reported level of usage that it's relatively small, essentially less than 10% of all clinical trials that are using AI and machine learning to support some of the planning and design areas, including trial design and protocol development and pre-study risk assessment. One of the top areas there may be, for example, the use of AI to cull and identify patients based on patient health data and electronic clinical data. In the execution stage, the detection and management of risk, as well as query detection, were some of the top areas that were mentioned on a relatively low percentage of trials. But in all of these areas, we saw projected dramatic growth in the expected usage within the next 3 to 4 years. Let's go now to the next slide. And we mentioned some of the challenges and the difficulties or barriers to adoption. Another area that we can look at are functions where with the highest perceived level of resistance to adoption. And interestingly here, our respondents noted that clinical operations functions and clinical functions are typically the places where you see the highest level or functions of resistance, with nearly comparable level coming from executive leadership. And what might be behind this? Well, we believe or suspect that the current operating conditions, as I noted at the beginning of the presentation, may have really created particular intensity for our clinical operating teams and our ClinOps professionals, who are really struggling now with the challenges of managing extremely complex clinical trial protocols and executing them. They're not as close to the use of RBQM to support the data management challenges that are presented by complexity. They're mostly facing a lot of the operating challenges, and they're less familiar with the role that RBQM might play in addressing some of the challenges moving forward. Let's go to the next slide. And essentially my last slide focusing on the results of the study, and then I'd like to open it up for any questions that you might have. But when we asked respondents to comment on solutions that might help stimulate adoption, hands down, the top area related to the need to create more awareness and visibility across functions on some of the successful RBQM implementation experiences, as a way of really demonstrating how RBQM may be addressing some of the critical objectives and delivering on its value proposition promises. Some of the other areas relate really to change management opportunities, including providing more training and actual focus on better change management planning activities and execution. Slightly less than 40% noted or suggested that organizations need to mandate the use of RBQM in order to really stimulate and drive adoption. So not the top solution mentioned, but within the top 5. So I'll stop there and open it up for any questions that you might have. And I, again, just wanted to remind all of you that we'll be publishing these detailed results. I've really gone through a very high level summary relatively quickly. And again, I just want to thank CluePoints. I want to thank RBQM Live for the opportunity to share some of these results and insights with you. So I'll open it up for any questions that you might have.
Ken, thanks very much for the presentation. That's fabulous, as usual. We've had a load of questions already. The Q&A will run for another 15 minutes, which is great. It gives us an opportunity to explore the thoughts of the participants that we've had today. I should say to the attending audience, if you have more questions, the Q&A is still open. We have people behind the scenes who are fielding these questions, so please make sure that you get them in to avoid disappointment, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. And for those that we don't answer, we'll try and give you some direct responses afterwards as well. So I'm going to start with one of the slides, Ken, that you presented towards the end of the session, and we've had a comment and question in regarding that slide, which is about the commitment to the organization in supporting RBQM, which had a pretty high response for that. The question was, do you have any thoughts on why the subgroups to do with that slide about the benefits of RBQM and the adoption of RBQM aren't higher and aren't nearer to 100%, given the clear benefits and the regulatory push for RBQM and new ICH E6R3 guidelines and so on? But the question is really, why didn't each of the subgroups not near 100%, do you think?
Yeah, and it's we expected to see it higher as well. I think it's a very good question. I think there are many factors involved. I think in larger organizations, you have such fragmented functional areas, in some cases where the translation of the importance and the encouragement of the importance has not been uniformly shared. So that a lot of the change management issues that we mentioned have not really translated uniformly across the organization. That's playing a part. As I mentioned, there's just intense pressure on performance today and efficiency. And when you have a lot of more junior level, execution level individuals, especially in the clinical operating areas, often the perceived risk is so much higher as well. So, with encouragement coming from regulatory agencies and perhaps less uniform encouragement coming from senior management, it's not making it down in a uniform and deep way throughout the organization. I think that's part of it. In smaller companies, you may also see spreading of RBQM responsibility. Some maintained internally, some that may be managed by a third party, a CRO, for example. So you see even more of that fragmentation in the closeness to RBM and RBQM, and even less uniformity across multiple organizations.
Yeah, and somebody else has speculated about lower adoption rates in smaller companies being correlated with the number of trials being run in phase one. So you've got a less sort of data-rich environment with which RBQM obviously functions best in using data-driven approaches. So that might have an effect on some of those adoption numbers as well.
And I wanted to mention, Patrick, last year at RBQM Live, I shared with everyone the typical adoption curve in our industry. Why does it take, for example, 20, 25 years for the industry as a whole to embrace new innovation that might be supporting an operating area? And we have to remember that RBQM is really essentially celebrating its 10th year. We're still in sort of that stage where you see really spotty levels of adoption, as it hasn't really trickled down to all of the functional areas and more of the junior level staff that are really entrusted with very tactical activities, and they're managing a tremendous amount of performance risk.
Yeah, and certainly from a CluePoints perspective, if I may offer that, what we've seen in the last 18 months probably is way more momentum towards adoption of RBQM. So it does sort of seem to speak to the fact that yes, at the levels within the organization that are saying, look, we can't afford to run clinical trials in the way that we have done. We have to become more efficient. We have to embrace risk-based approaches. There seems to be that message that's coming from the top. But you're right, it then needs to be picked up and acted upon by every member of cross-functional teams across the organization. And as we know, in our industry, I'm sure in other industries as well, the management of change is crucially important to make sure that people can take advantage and gain the efficiency that's expected from these types of techniques. Yeah. But there is certainly a sea change in the thinking that we just can't keep doing what we continue to do. That's the definition of madness. We have to go through this paradigm shift. We have to adopt these risk-based approaches. Now, how are we going to do it? And it's that's perhaps stalled adoption rates, because everybody wants to do it. Everybody knows they need to do it. Just had a question in from one of the CRO participants on the session today to say, we're encouraging the use of RBQM amongst our sponsor community. And whilst they're excited and interested about what they're going to gain from it, they're still hesitant to move forward. I guess they're hesitant to move forward. And in some ways, the question is, what's the best way to encourage them to adopt? It's really showcasing some of the huge gains that some of these sponsors have gained already from the use of the approach. So the more avant-garde sponsors, those more enlightened approaches to how to embrace the change that's necessary, have really paid off. And we've seen that with companies where the real cost benefits of reducing SDV, for example. We've got a couple of cases where customers have eradicated SDV entirely, not SDR, I might add, but SDV. That comes with a huge ticket in terms of cost, which can be, you can demonstrate real tangible benefits, not just, your quality of data is going to get better, and that's going to have this huge knock-on effect that's quite difficult to calculate, but real tangible cost benefits. Eradicating SDVs, what, 15% of a trial budget, something like that? So maybe those are the answers to why sponsors should do it faster than they're able to at the moment. I don't know whether you've got thoughts yourself, Ken.
I think it's such a great point, Patrick. And in fact, we found that the companies that had reported the highest levels of adoption were the ones that had done a better job of showcasing internally some of the success stories. They had vetted and shared, as you mentioned, some of the actual quantified areas of impact, including cost savings, time savings, and they clearly had, I think, a better ability to manage the perceptions and shape the perceptions within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. A bit of a more of a sort of a tactical question, but one that I think is an important one, because I know I've heard it myself a lot in recent weeks, and that's regarding QTLs. So we know, because of the draft guidance for ICHR 3, that QTLs are no longer referenced at all, and yet in R2 they were quite a big part of the guidance that people had jumped on and said, how are we going to do this? Does anybody know? Where's the expertise going to come from? So what do you think that the reference now to thresholds and the way that it's described in R3, and I have my own views of this, of course, but what impact will that have on their usage? So, the slide that you presented showed a high uptake for QTLs, and yet the new guidance doesn't show any reference to quality tolerance limits. What do you think is going to happen in that regard?
So I'm going to punt on that one, Patrick. In part because I know you're much closer to this, and if I can actually invite your impressions. As I mentioned, we were really trying to measure current adoption, and we have not really rectified the results of the study with R3. And I know that you and your colleagues have already been doing some of that assessment. So let me just open it up and invite your comment.
Sure. Well, from our understanding and our interpretation of the guidance, the area of quality tolerance limits is well and truly covered. They've just decided, instead of making it a very specific item that people are getting quite sort of het up about, they've described it differently. But essentially, the thresholds and the tolerance limits that are being described are exactly the same. They've just chosen to not use a 3-letter acronym to describe them. So I think all the concepts and the reasons that they are such fundamental things to adopt within the studies is exactly the same. It's just described differently. So I don't think anybody who's adopted QTLs can throw their hands up in the air and say, that was a waste of time. I think those companies have done exactly the right thing. And the encouragement is, let's just soften the language a little bit so that we can perhaps describe this in a bit more easy to understand, quality by design type vernacular, and then we might get a better uptake. So I think it's rather than sort of thinking, I need to adopt these things called QTLs that I don't know anything about. The description about what they're there for and how they're going to help is exactly the same. So I don't think it should have a fundamental difference.
That's great. And I think even within the survey responses, we saw that effect. For example, there were cases where smaller companies might have reported that a higher level of risk planning usage, but when it came to their use of KRIs and some of the very defined areas, it was softer usage. And it may in fact be, as you're noting, because they may not be using a strict approach, but they did report using an approach that took into account some of these principles or relied on a third party, a CRO, to support that as well.
Yeah, indeed. I agree. Another question here. Any thoughts on the lower percentage agreement that was demonstrated that RBQM may reduce timelines? And the speculation here from the viewer is maybe this is due to the link between RBQM to timeline reduction is just difficult to illustrate. And the participant here would love our thoughts on the ways to prospectively start to measure and show this.
In general, it's a great question. In general, we have yet to see any solution that has ultimately impacted timelines. So, in part because the level of complexity is rising at a faster rate than our ability to address it, whether it's the use of a virtual or remote technology, it's the use of an RBQM component. So that, in a lot of ways, is one of the most difficult areas to demonstrate impact anyway. And I think in the absence of taking the time to develop a set of reasonable measures, which very few organizations are able to do, it's very rare that we ever demonstrate timeline impact. We might show that a particular study came in closer to plan, but even there, organizations approach their planned timelines in different ways. Some adjust the planned timeline on an ongoing basis. So I agree with the comment that was made that in general, it's really hard to even measure impact on time. And as an enterprise, it's an area where we rarely see time savings as a true value or return on investment area.
Yeah, one of my thoughts on this, and I agree, it's very, very difficult because, and there's a lot of competing elements to a trial that causes the delays, as we know. One of the things I think I should mention on our side is one of the very positive things is what we see is a reduction in failure of first cycle review. And obviously that has an implication massively on the timelines overall, because we're seeing that the quality of the data, so the submission reviews are not being failed because of the quality of the data. So you've passed a minimum hurdle, minimum level of requirement in terms of the data completeness, the data accuracy, the data integrity, that isn't causing regulators to kick back and say, I think there's some discrepancies here that you might need to go and look at. Go away and do that, then come back and submit again. So that's the one thing that we're seeing big reductions in the failure of first cycle review, because we've been able to get the data quality and integrity up to a level that the regulators say, right, this is great. Now we can really start to look at efficacy and safety, aspects. So we've cleared that first hurdle. And of course, anything that goes back after first cycle review is what, a minimum of 6 months before you're able to resubmit, just because of all the work that's necessary to be done. That has huge implications on the timelines, but also on the costs. Maybe you have to open up some more sites, collect some more data. I mean, there's just endless amounts of problems that causes. So what I would say is that in the context of timelines, that's helping massively from not being in the position where you fail that first cycle review. We've got not much time left, a couple of minutes. Maybe we can take a quick one. Maybe it's not so quick, but let's give it a go. So we should integrate quality, sustainable development, and business drivers needs into the process. This would speed the adoption. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that really addresses some of the major challenges that were articulated. We have not found the ideal way to integrate those objectives and create a business imperative for adoption. And I think that is one of the reasons why, as you were suggesting, Patrick, there's been this hesitancy to move forward in the absence of mandated use, right? It's encouraged, but the value proposition and the business imperative has not really been integrated. And I think some of the solutions that we noted might really help in that area, really promoting and featuring case examples, showcasing examples where that business imperative was addressed.
Well, I think, Ken, that gives us a tremendous segue into the rest of RBQM Live 2023, because I'm pretty sure that the audience is going to see quite a lot of tangible examples of how this has helped them and where RBQM is going in the future. So thank you so much for your time today, and for the team at Tufts as well, who should be noted has played a huge part in the research effort and the results that you've presented. So we're always indebted to you to be able to do this keynote address, and I'm afraid you've become an RBQM Live lifer now as a result. So we can expect the same for next year.
Thank you.
As we conclude the session, we would encourage you to reach out to contact@cluepoints.com. That's contact@cluepoints.com if you would like to request the recording of the session or elements of the presentation that Ken has given. And as you say, Ken, I know that you're going to be publishing this industry-wide, which is going to be a huge help, I'm sure, in terms of the ability for organizations to convince their senior leadership that this is something that's going to drive them forward. I should also welcome everybody now to join our RBQM Chat Cafe, where we're going to continue the discussion around this session and the conclusions that we've drawn. And also beginning at 9:40 a.m. Eastern Time, we're going to have our second session of the day, which is entitled The ABCs of ICH E6R3, Understanding the Guidance Updates. And that's with Dave Nickerson, who's the head of clinical quality management at EMD Serono. So some of the questions and some of the themes from this session is going to be picked up directly in the next. In the meantime, enjoy RBQM Chat Cafe. And as usual, Ken, I'd just leave you with the last word, if that's okay.
I just want to say what a delight it has been to be here. And I look forward to next year as well.
Super. Thanks so much, Ken. And enjoy the rest of the show, everybody.
Great. Thank you.